Hi everyone, this week's video is on the issue of bumping in a redundancy situation. You might not have come across the term before, specifically in a restructure context, and that's because I don't think it's particularly commonly used. Bumping is the process of moving a potentially redundant employee into another role, typically a more junior role, and dismissing the employee who is currently performing that different or more junior role. It doesn't really sit well within the definition of redundancy because the person who is displaced and is ultimately dismissed may not be in a role where we've actually identified a reduced need for work of a particular kind to be carried out. But nevertheless, if an employee is bumped into somebody else's role and that person moves on, the reason for their dismissal will be redundancy. The question at the outset of every redundancy situation is, must we consider bumping? And we're referring to a situation most commonly where we have a senior employee, so it may be a team manager, for example. We're stripping out that layer of management and making that one role redundant. The question is, should I be considering bumping that employee into a more junior role, such as removing one of his team members, such that the manager drops down and performs one of the junior members' roles? There's nothing in the legislation specifically on this. We're judging this based on case law as part of an obligation to follow a fair and reasonable process. There is no general obligation on us to consider bumping, so it's not the case that in every redundancy situation we have to look at whether we can put somebody down into a more junior role. But there is case law to support it being unreasonable not to consider bumping in particular circumstances. We have the case of SAML and the University of Creative Arts, which confirmed it's not compulsory for an employer to consider whether it should bump an employee. It can be very detrimental to employee relations, and in essence it is a voluntary procedure. Unfortunately, the law isn't as simplistic as that, and we have got cases such as Thomas and Betts Manufacturing, which has concluded that it was unfair not to consider bumping. In this case, we had a fitter who was also trained to undertake more junior packing work, and it was never considered whether the fitter could be bumped into that more junior role, and thus the dismissal was unfair. With the case of Lionel Leventhal Limited and North, a senior editor selected for redundancy on the grounds he was the company's most expensive employee. The tribunal considered that he should have been at least reviewed. The position should have been reviewed as to whether he could take a more junior role and whether he could be bumped. And unfortunately, as we often see, the judgment stated it's a finding of fact for the tribunal to make. So they have to come to their own assessment as to whether it was reasonable or not to not consider bumping the employee into a more junior role. The Bonacera case went even further than this and stated that the onus is on the employer to raise with a potentially redundant employee the possibility of bumping them into a more junior position. So it's not the case that in order for a complaint to be made out by an employee during the process, he himself has to raise that he could be bumped into another role. It's for the employer to take account of the circumstances and potentially engage with the employee around whether that's appropriate or not. There is, however, other case law which has made it clear that applying the facts of those cases, it wasn't reasonable to consider bumping. And that leaves us in quite an uncertain position when we start a restructure exercise. We need to look essentially at what factors are in play which would justify the use or not of bumping an employee. So just thinking about our experience in previous exercises, say we do have a senior manager in a business and we are considering whether it's appropriate to look to bump them into a more junior role. I would firstly look at the change in terms and conditions. So is there a huge drop in salary? Is there a huge drop in authority and responsibility? That alone may make it inappropriate to consider bumping. What will the impact be on this employee and the team members? The manager may have been a manager for many, many years, may have been responsible for managing the individuals he might be working alongside now. And that might just not be palatable from an employee relations perspective. When we're looking at the more junior team members, what are their abilities Do they themselves form quite an intrinsic part of the business? Are they multi-skilled and can they assist elsewhere? If so, removing them from the business could actually cause us more harm than bumping a more senior employee into that role. Similarly to that, what skills do we want to retain? So if the junior employees are ones who have particular skills that we want to retain or we may make more use of in the future, do we want to retain those or lose that at the expense of moving a more senior employee in? And looking at the senior employee themselves stepping down, do they need to be retrained in any way? So often managers don't actually, get their hands dirty and not necessarily doing the mechanics of the more junior roles that they perform. So is there a lot of retraining that's going to be required if we want to step them down? And then other factors as well, length of service may be important. So if we had a junior employee who we brought in a couple of months ago, it may be a lot easier to justify moving the more senior person into that position. If all of the junior employees have 10, 15 years of unblemished service and are really loyal and valued by the business, again, we're going to potentially cause a lot of damage to employee relations by moving the senior employee in there. So lots to take into account, and it really should be identified at the start of the process whether we are going to approach the issue of bumping. We may want a paper trail in terms of proof that we've considered that at the time and dismissed it if we're going to do so. Otherwise, bumping is quite a viable option and can be used to retain more senior skills in the business. If you need any more help on this, or if you want to sign up to our Monday morning dispatch to get all the employment news on a weekly basis from us, please do get in touch, employmenthub@chadlaw.co.uk. Thank you.